I was thinking about point-to-point communication, and what I believe is that there's only a handful of options for one person to communicate directly to another person. So the gold standard of communicating to another person is clearly a phone call. When you have a good phone call with a collaborator or a relative or a friend, it's a really profound experience. It is, however, completely temporary because phone calls are not recorded. So you might have an amazing conversation, but it's just like having a conversation in the real world. It's temporary, kind of whips away. But most two-way communication modes are temporary and not permanent because they usually reflect simultaneity, like Skype and phone calls. Well, it's tough to make the argument that phone calls are about the past. Phone calls are about the present. They're about right now, as are Skype phone calls. And that is the biggest issue with phone calls as a paradigm. People are not always free. People do not necessarily have phone numbers attached to them when they're in your contacts, even if you want to reach them. So you're left defaulting away from phone calls for communication purposes in most cases because phone calls are actually an elaborate powwow. So short of that, we love text messaging, of course. Text messaging is a way of pinging one another without the elaborate powwow of a phone call. You can simply get a quick text over to somebody and they will react to that and text you back, or maybe you'll arrange a real-time meeting or a phone call. So text messaging forms like this backup plan to making a phone call. And because it's asynchronous, we generally reach people. So it has a way higher percentage of getting reached, unlike voicemail, which is usually like a consolation prize to phone calling. And we all know people who don't check their voicemails religiously and they miss messages. The problem with text messaging, of course, is it's very short, 140 characters, limit that Twitter messaging also has. Twitter lets you communicate directly online, but most of the communications on Twitter seem to me to be at messages because the DM private path is not as well established as a dominant paradigm. So Twitter messages have the disadvantage of being over the air, like in the open, which is usually not the optimal model for point-to-point, person-to-person communication. So that leaves us with Facebook messages. We're all part of Facebook. We're all on Facebook. And 950 million users, I guess, is the most recent number. And the messaging platform inside Facebook is its own separate type of email, and it comes with notifications that matter a lot. I think one of the biggest issues with email is I don't get notified properly of when I get new emails. I also have email boxes that are just totally filled up with newsletters, and I'm always missing emails, whereas Facebook messages tends to be a little bit cleaner because you're only going to get messages that pop through properly from people who are on your social graph already, so the signal-to-noise ratio is really high. So what I'd like to close this with is that TinyVox is a brand new capability for asynchronous voice communication. So what is asynchronous voice communication? It's like a YouTube video like this is an asynchronous voice communication. I'm creating it right now on September 12th, 2012 at 12:42 p.m. and you are listening to this at a later point in time. So that is what asynchronous means. I'm here in the timeline, you're somewhere else, you're later, right? So this is how text messaging works. It's how email works. It's that you compose the email at your leisure and your recipient reads the email, hopefully they get it. Deliverability is always an issue, but they will read it on their own time. And the same goes with text messaging. Even though it's much more immediate, still you can take a message and think about it before replying. You don't have to be on the spot like a phone call. So that's another sort of a disadvantage of Skype and phone calls and video calling as well. You're putting people on the spot and you're demanding to interrupt them. And they might be in the middle of something. It's almost like if I can make people feel a little bit less inclined to call and make TinyVox tapes with their stories instead, I just think that our communications would become that much more efficient. And we are working, of course, on future models with TinyVox. We just think that audio is the communication solution because the phone is incredibly popular. I mean, it's never going to go away, right? But how often do you want to communicate with people and you just can't get them on the phone? Or like, for me, it's happened so many times that I barely even try getting some of my friends on the phone. So hopefully, if you're one of my friends and you're hearing this, you know, feel free to get up with me. Particularly if you just want to tweet at me, you should do that. So like I am not interrupted, right? Like we all are very busy, and to interrupt people with phone calls is just like so Neanderthal. Like again, your closest friends and your family, of course, make phone calls, you know. But in general, I just think the phone is like the old way of doing things, and TinyVox is the new breed.